Our speaker today, Dr. Daniel Ellsberg, holds a BA summa cum laude from Harvard and a PhD in economics from that same institution. He was an officer in the United States Marine Corps from 1954 to 57 and served as a rifle platoon leader, rifle company commander, and operations officer. Dr. Ellsberg's many years of government service included serving as consultant to the Defense and State Departments for a number of years and also at the White House, where he dealt with command and control of nuclear weapons and on strategic nuclear war plans. He has also been a special assistant to Deputy Ambassador William Porter at the U.S. Embassy in South Vietnam. He has been a consultant to the Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, McGeorge Bundy, during the Kennedy years. He dealt with strategic war plans and on delegation of presidential authority to execute nuclear war plans. He has also been a consultant to the former Secretary of State and Special Assistant to the President, Dr. Henry Kissinger. Daniel Ellsberg is best known for his involvement with the McNamara Task Force paper entitled History of the United States Decision-Making in Vietnam from 1945 through 68, that resulted in the now very famous U.S. Supreme Court case, United States versus New York Times, or better known as the Pentagon Papers case. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Dr. Daniel Ellsberg.
Thank you. Which is the, what's the sound here? We have a sound, okay? Thank you. Thank you. Flying up here today and reading the papers about the speech we're to expect from the President tonight on Central America, I'm really reminded, my mind is now preoccupied in the last few hours, much more with the Marine part of my background on the one hand, the Vietnam experience, which took about 10 years of my life. Then I am with the nuclear preoccupation, which has been a preoccupation of mine really since August 6, 1945, but was a professional concern. I guess you need these. Sorry, I'll try to accommodate these microphones. Was a professional concern from the late 50s through the mid-60s when I began to work on Vietnam. In 1961, I don't know, didn't quite pick up whether it was mentioned or not, my job was to write the first Kennedy administration guidelines, top secret guidelines, for the annual operating plan for general nuclear war. And that job was based on my knowledge of the Eisenhower plans that we had inherited. I, at that point, probably knew more about our nuclear war plans than any other civilian at that time. And I look at what's happening now in the way of policy with the background of that experience. Is there a connection, really, between what we're about to hear from the President? There have been fairly considerable indications already that he's going to ask for more money and to increase the public's sense of stakes in Central America. Is there a connection between our current and perhaps expanding intervention in Central America and the risks of nuclear war? At first glance, one could say no. The actual threats that the United States has made of initiating nuclear war, perhaps a dozen times or so since Nagasaki, have always involved places where our interventions were so far from our shores, in Korea, Indochina, lately in the Middle East, in the Taiwan Straits, that the Marines or Allied troops or other troops that were endangered then and were being protected by the threat to use nuclear weapons really could be protected no other reliable way, or so it seemed at the time, than by nuclear threats. I'll get to the specifics of some of those later. But in Central America, in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, or in Guatemala, should we become involved there, that's close enough to our fleet, air support, even to the United States itself, the continental United States, that we could devastate those countries with high explosive quite thoroughly, as we did the country of Vietnam, even, from the sea, and with B-52s, without using nuclear weapons. The likelihood of using nuclear weapons directly in Central America is no doubt very small. But there's another side to it. When then Secretary of State Haig, formerly commander in NATO, described the problem early in the Reagan administration, he lost no opportunity really to indicate that in his military opinion, it was necessary to go to what he saw as the source of the trouble, cutting off, interdicting the flow of supplies into that entire area from Cuba, and to launch a blockade of Cuba. That would be a replay, essentially, of President Kennedy's quarantine of Cuba, so-called quarantine, because blockade is an act of war, and questions were raised within the White House and the Pentagon then of whether President Kennedy should use the word blockade without declaring war, which of course he can't do constitutionally, and so whether he should ask Congress for a declaration of war and so forth. Chose not to do that, so he more or less invented the word quarantine for the blockade. I know this because I was, as a consultant, working on the Cuban Missile Crisis in 2 of the 3 working groups that were reporting to the National Security Committee during that period. The 2 that I was working on were short-term planning for the invasion that was to take place really 2 days after, in fact, or 1 day, the day after the Sunday that Khrushchev actually began taking the missiles out. You'll recall that. So that was essentially 2, 3, 4 days, depending where we started on the planning. We were looking toward that invasion, accompanied by a strike against the missiles. The other planning group that I was in was under Walt Rostow and was called the Long Range Planning Group. It looked 2 weeks ahead, which is what long range usually really does mean in the government, but for once they came right out and admitted it. That is the usual perspective. As a matter of fact, I can say that what was for much of the country a considerably tense period of crisis, how many people here remember that, actually? Yes. Well, for people in the Pentagon, those of us who were sleeping in the Pentagon, as I was part of the time, it was tense, as always, but on the whole simpler and less complicated than usual, since there was only one crisis they were looking at one moment, not the usual budget crisis and the press conference crisis and everything which always has the same intensity. Everything did narrow down to this one problem. You could focus on one problem for a whole week. It was really a very, like a vacation almost. The third group that I did not participate in directly was called the Berlin Planning Group. And the reason why there was a Berlin group during the Cuban crisis is very relevant to our subject today. Let me come back to that. In any case, as I say, I not only then was directly involved, but that gave me such an intense sense of the risks of nuclear war arising out of the superpower interactions, and indeed possibly resulting from U.S. policies, of which I was a part up to that point, that I arranged the formation of a study group, of which I was the one member, reporting, which finally did get approved, and spent most of a year studying the Cuban Missile Crisis 2 years later in 1964, before I joined the government officially. I did this again as a consultant from RAND, reading every piece of classified paper that could be found in the government on the crisis to do a study of how close we'd come to war and what lessons were to be learned from that particular crisis. To come back then to Central America and what the President is talking about tonight, an increased American involvement over our present real involvement in Central America has more than seeds. It has trees that are, on their way to sprouting at this point of a direct confrontation over Cuba. And now, as then, the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc, supplies almost all of Cuba's oil and many other supplies. That's what long range meant by Walt Rostow, cutting off the oil, essentially, at that time. And thus involves an inevitable confrontation with the Soviet Union. A blockade of Cuba does, in fact, would be very damaging over the long run to Cuba. They require this flow of supplies and would bring us into direct conflict with Soviet shipping. So it would be a replay of the Cuban crisis of 1962, which many of you who raised your hands, I suspect, are remembering from a period when you were a couple of years old, or 5 years old, or 6 years old. Could I see the hands again of people who remember that crisis? How old were you then? You were 7. Anybody remember it who was younger than that? Nobody younger than 7? How old were you? Well, why does one remember this at 7? Well, you know, the question answers itself for all of us. Because it was a time when the world was conscious of living on the brink of nuclear war. In actual fact, that did not distinguish it from a number of other periods which you don't remember. How many people here, I'm sure there are some, but how many remember the Taiwan Straits crisis of 1958? Fair number, smaller. How about 55? Remember that one? Who will forget? You know, who can forget? Well, a lot of people have forgotten. How many people recall the nuclear crisis of 1953? That's very good. What was that? Can you tell us? What was the nuclear crisis in 53? I'm sorry, you had your hand up, I thought, but who had their hand? You had your hand up next to him? Do you remember what it was?
Russia had the atom bomb.
No, Russia first exploded their atom bomb in 1949, which created quite a bit of concern. But I'll tell you in 53. It's one that we have a good documentation on now. We didn't have any publicly until actually it was mentioned in the 50s, but in 61, President Eisenhower, in his memoirs, sold us the information over the counter that he had in 1953 carried out his campaign pledge to end the war in Korea, you remember that, in a way that he hadn't told us at the time. It was fairly well known that General MacArthur had advised him to make a nuclear ultimatum to the Chinese at that point to get the war over. A lot of talk about that. And that he had given that advice to President Eisenhower. At that point, he had a secret plan to win the war, to end the war. When he announced that publicly, in fact, Truman, who was still president after the election, said, I demand, you know, if you have a way to end the war, you give it to the president. I'm still president, there's a war on, and so forth. And I'm not sure whether actually MacArthur did that. MacArthur had been fired, of course, as commander in Korea by Truman, and they weren't talking, sort of, at that point. So he may not have given him his plan. The plan was, indeed, to threaten the Chinese that they would be hit with nuclear weapons if they did not meet our demands at the negotiating table. And what Eisenhower informed us, and this was potentially news, was that he had accepted that plan and had carried it out. As Eisenhower says in his memoirs, he told the Chinese through several channels explicitly, but secretly, that he would, not might, but would use nuclear weapons against China, as well as in Korea and Manchuria, if they did not meet his rather modest demands at Panmunjom from an armistice. Second, he says something very significant, that in his belief it was only these threats which brought about the armistice and which led the Chinese to keep the armistice. So he regarded the threats then as highly successful. But he didn't announce them at the time, you notice. He announced them in 1961. How many people here did not know that Eisenhower had made this revelation? Well, thank you. That was a nuclear crisis you missed then. You needn't lose any sleep over it now. It was 30 years ago. Still, you might ask yourselves, what is to be learned about the adequacy of your background reading or your newspaper accounts of the nuclear world that we live in, that it's never really brought it to your attention, the courses you take at this college, which is no different from anywhere else. Very few people, in fact, I found in America recall that threat in 1953 at all. It's confirmed, by the way, by a number of places, in particular Eisenhower's conclusion that this threat was crucial has been confirmed by people like Sherman Adams, his chief of staff, who has said in his memoirs that Eisenhower had told him very emphatically that he felt nothing else had done that, in a very frank conversation that he had with him at one point. Others have confirmed the existence of the threat. Not the Chinese, by the way, who were not anxious to reveal that they had backed down to a nuclear ultimatum at a time when, of course, they had no nuclear weapons. They did not want to encourage more. They didn't want to tell their own people they had backed down. And that's typical of the other threats that come in. In the one case that is very public, where Khrushchev backed down by taking the missiles out of Cuba, that was a crucial factor, obviously, in his losing his job within 2 years. And I mentioned the Taiwan Straits crisis. That's probably in 1955 and again in 58. I won't go into the details of that now, except to say that again, Eisenhower told, in this case, the Joint Chiefs of Staff to make their plans entirely on the use of nuclear weapons if the Chinese on the mainland should invade these little islands a few miles off their shores, islands that were regarded by both sides in what we regarded as a continuing civil war in China, the Taiwan-based nationalists and the mainland Chinese communist regime. Both sides regarded those islands as part of the mainland. The only dispute was who ran the mainland, Chiang Kai-shek on Taiwan in 1958 or Mao Zedong in Peking. We regarded that as a live dispute at that point, as did Chiang. So we backed Chiang in putting 300,000 of his troops on these islands so close to the shore of the Chinese mainland that loudspeaker campaigns were carried on both sides. And the islands could be blockaded, in that case, by the Chinese. They didn't have to use ships. They could blockade them with shore-based artillery all around the island, even rather short-range artillery. And that was keeping our supply ships out. We were, in other words, in a position somewhat comparable to Russia's position in supplying Cuba, subject then to interdiction, in this case by artillery. If that blockade should continue to be successful, or if they should try to invade, the Joint Chiefs were told by President Eisenhower to prepare to use nuclear weapons. In effect, the trigger to our nuclear weapons was passed to the Chinese at that point. We sent them a red phone or a red button or something. We said, you do this, you do that, and you get nuclear weapons, actually. No great secret was made about this from the Chinese. General LeMay, commander of SAC, was sent to inspect these little islands off the coast. That was regarded as a highly public signal, as it was. There was much talk of the possible use of nuclear weapons. It leaked, not confirmed by the White House, but the Chinese, again, were left in no doubt about it, and they did back off. The threat succeeded in 58, just as it may have in 53 have been a factor. Of course, the Chinese had no nuclear weapons at that time, but the Russians did have, and they were at that time allied to the Soviets. According to the Chinese, they asked Khrushchev at that point, precisely in this crisis, for two promises. One, that he would retaliate, the Russians would retaliate, if the U.S. used nuclear weapons against Russia's ally, China. And second, that the Chinese themselves would be given control for further deterrence of at least a couple small nuclear weapons from the Soviets of their own to pose an even more immediate threat of retaliation. Khrushchev refused both of these. And that was a major cause, according to analysts of this, of the Russian-Chinese split. Another great success, then, for nuclear threats on both counts, both the immediate count, not too important. We still have Chinese nationalist troops based on Quemoy, for what that's worth, because of this threat. And there was the Chinese-Soviet split, which certainly would be regarded as a major diplomatic triumph for the U.S. as a result, just as the back down over Cuba could be said to, which led, among other things, to the limited test ban treaty in '63, to Khrushchev's ouster, to be sure, which wasn't clear whether that was good or bad at the time. All of these then were successes. As I talk about nuclear threats and the U.S. nuclear threat policy, I'm going to be very critical of that policy, especially now, but not because it can't work. The problem with nuclear threats is not, as I see it, that they cannot achieve either a short-term success or conceivably even longer-term victories of some sort. The problem, especially today, has to do with the fact that they may not work, that to make them credible almost inevitably, or does in any case, involve us in taking actions which make it very difficult for us to back down from that threat, to fail to carry out the threat. That's the way you make the threat credible. You put the weapons in the area where they're subject to attack, in fact, even by non-nuclear means. You make commitments and statements on the importance of this issue. You put troops at risk who may need to be defended. You do all of these things, as we're doing right now in the Middle East, for example. All of these things which make it much more likely that the war will occur, the nuclear war will occur, if the other side doesn't back down. Now, many people who favor further increases in our nuclear weapons and who favor nuclear first-use threats by the United States, and those two things I think go intrinsically together, those two policies, talk about advocates, let's say, of a freeze and other bilateral freeze as people who trust the Soviets. Well, I don't trust the Soviets. I don't know who trusts the Soviets. It's hard to meet somebody. I don't know any reason for trusting the Soviets, but it seems to me that the people who favor this policy and the nuclear weapons that go along with it trust the Soviet Union a good deal more than I do in a lot of different ways. Very specifically, they seem to trust them always to back down in such crises. That every Cuban Missile Crisis we play, every Taiwan Straits crisis, will have the same result. Now, that's not the way it looked at the time. For all the confidence that there was in the Pentagon, and there was reason for it, which I'll come to, there was nothing like confidence at that time that the results would be what they were. President Kennedy is quoted by his brother and by his speechwriter, Ted Sorensen, as saying at the time that he felt the chances of general war over the Cuban Missile Crisis were between 1/3 and 1/2. Well, that means, at best, that as he saw it, there was a 2/3 chance that we would win, or that they would back down, or at least that no war would result. Only 1/3 chance that, as he put it, quoted by his brother in the memoir 13 Days, hundreds of millions of people would die. That was a fairly public crisis, and that's what got people excited, and that's why so many of you do remember it to this day. But we probably got at least as close as that to nuclear war in '58, and you don't remember that because you weren't told about it, or '53, and there were other occasions as well. Still, the odds were a lot better then than they are today or ever will be again for the success of this kind of nuclear diplomacy. That's easy to explain why. But I say it's easy to explain why if you know certain things which, again, have really been held secret to this day. The Berlin crisis of '61, another nuclear crisis, and the Cuban crisis the next year of '62 were held in the wake of an election that was run on the missile gap. How many people remember that? Right, remember that? It was the missile gap that recruited me into the line of work that I got into concern with nuclear war planning. It seemed to me nothing could be more important in the world than to prevent a nuclear war from ever taking place. And the way to do that, as I understood first from newspapers and then from top secret estimates, was to deter the Soviet Union from using its preponderance of nuclear military force, its preponderance of missiles, which it would have by 1960 or at the latest 61, from attacking the United States in a surprise attack. For those of you who don't remember the campaign of 60, I'm telling you, you'll recognize it. The campaign of 60 sounded very like the campaign of 1980, where we were warned by the successful candidate that a gap had been allowed to occur, that we had fallen behind the Soviet Union, that inferiority was not imminent, it was here, and that it was necessary to make an enormous military buildup in order to reverse that. The buildup that we are urged to make right now by President Reagan is in fact not significantly greater in relative terms than the buildup that Kennedy did undertake at that point, right at that time, an enormous buildup. The prediction precisely was that the Soviets would have probably something like 160, maybe 300 missiles, ICBMs, intercontinental missiles, by 1961, if not by 1960, if they made an even stronger effort. And that this would go on to be thousands of missiles by the late 60s. In August of our programs led us to have, I believe our first operational ICBMs were in 59, if I recall, some few Atlas ICBMs. But by 1961, we had 40 intercontinental ballistic missiles, plus about 48 Polaris warheads at sea, 3 submarines by the end of the year, plus about 120 intermediate range missiles, shorter range missiles, based in Turkey, England, and Italy. Very similar to the plans for intermediate range basing right now, except that Germany, for example, has added to them. But England is right now scheduled for cruise missiles, Italy for cruise missiles, Turkey not at the moment. So we had these intermediate range missiles based there. About 200 warheads then facing the Soviet Union at that time, within range of the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union at that time had no forward bases, so they relied on intercontinental missiles. In the summer of 1961, the summer of the Berlin crisis, which at the end of the summer the wall went up in Berlin, but that did not end the crisis, which persisted for another couple of months at least. In that summer, the intelligence estimate was that the Soviets had in fact produced only 120 missiles, intercontinental missiles, although the State Department thought it was 160. There was a range of discussion. The Air Force thought it was higher than that, and the commander of Strategic Air Command, Thomas Power, said at Strategic Air Command when I was there in August of 1961 on a visit from the Pentagon, that it was his estimate that the Soviets at that time had 1,000 missiles. It was that month that Kennedy told the American people to prepare fallout shelters by the end of the year, starting quite a boom in fallout shelters and also a good deal of controversy about it. How many people remember that? Just because I want to come back to it. Okay, and that one stuck in people's minds, right? Could I see the hands again on that one? How do you remember that? You must have been pretty young. How old were you?
I was about 14, and how I remember it is I was living in a city. I was living in Los Angeles. My parents were Canadians and moved to LA. And people in their backyards had fallout shelters, and they had submarine openings in the backyard. The openings were like in a submarine trapdoor type thing. My neighbor had one, and we used to go play in it.
Your neighbor had one?
Yes, and they had stored food.
What was your neighbor's policy on letting the family come in case the thing was needed?
I don't recall.
Was there any discussion between the two families?
If there was, I don't remember. I just remember it was fun to go in and out of it. We played, war and fallout.
Okay, well, I asked that because some of you will remember, until this year, when the Catholic bishops and others have been debating nuclear issues and war and peace, I think the first and only ethical debate among churchmen on these nuclear matters was over this issue in '61. Focused on the question of not of our policies or how the war might come about, but on the question of whether a Christian, within the bounds, let's say, of just war doctrine criteria, could legitimately arm themselves with, say, machine guns to repel neighbors who had not provided themselves with a fallout shelter. Do you recall that? You were 14. You recall that discussion? Who remembers that discussion? Anybody? A lot of people. You may remember how it came out that I think all the churchmen I recall said, balancing this against that, yes, it was legitimate for a Christian to kill their neighbors if the neighbors had not provided themselves prudently with this preparation for nuclear war. And now, of the actual balance, however, was confirmed, before the crisis was over, was confirmed by a new estimate based on satellite reconnaissance in September of 1961, which confirmed what one can now realize the Joint Chiefs had known all along. And that was that the Soviets had what the Army and Navy had been saying. They'd been saying a few for some years, nuclear missiles. The number was 4. Not 160 or 120, not 1,000. That was off by 250 times, not 250%. It was 250 times off in its estimate. They had 4 missiles to our 200 warheads. The balance isn't the critical thing here because actually our main forces still were represented by our 3,000 bombers in range of Russia. 2,000 intercontinental, 1,000 based forward. They had 193 bombers within range of the United States. How many people here now who raised your hands earlier who remember the fallout scare and the threat of nuclear war over Berlin in 1961 were clear in your minds at the time that had there been a nuclear war over Berlin, it would not have been started as a nuclear war by the Soviet Union, but would have amounted to an escalation by the United States, a first strike in nuclear terms by the United States. How many people here realized that then? Can I see hands? I see 1, 2. You realized it then? I don't embarrass anybody here, but how old were you? You were really 21? 20 years ago? Congratulations. I want to get your secret after you look about 21. Okay, 2 people in the audience, which leaves a good many of you who weren't in the picture as to what President Kennedy was offering us as a policy. I can tell you, as somebody who, as I say, wrote the war plan that year, President Kennedy was not worrying that the Soviets would launch nuclear war with their 4 ICBMs. It was a U.S. first strike that, in fact, was being talked about. Not a strike out of the blue. It was a strike that would emerge over a conflict in Berlin. There's an interesting parallel between Berlin and some of the other cases that I mentioned to you. Berlin is an island, in effect, like Quemoy off Taiwan, off the Chinese mainland. It's surrounded by East German and Soviet troops. The enormous Soviet superiority in that area does not reflect the superiority of the Warsaw Pact in general to NATO. In fact, in numbers, there is no such superiority. I won't go into it, but in fact, the numbers actually in active duty and in reserves in NATO and Warsaw Pact, contrary to what you have heard 1,000 times, have always been about equal. One year NATO's will be superior in numbers. The next year Warsaw Pact goes up and down. They're very closely comparable. But in Berlin is a different story. There, that is inside East Germany. The superiority there is very difficult to do anything about. And if U.S. troops had gone through to Berlin at that point, the Soviets might have backed down. Had they not backed down, these, by the way, these were the plans that Paul Nitze was in charge of in '61. I was working as a consultant in Nitze's shop, if you know that, if you know his name. He was in charge of the Berlin planning in '62 as well during the Cuban crisis. The plans then called for, first, conventional challenge. By the way, in a legal situation that was rather murky, the better argument was on our side, but the basis of the crisis was Khrushchev's claim that he had the right to sign a peace treaty at last with East Germany, after which, he said, they would control their own territory. And again, I can say from studying the legal briefs of this at the State Department, one could argue against that point, and the point that they had no right to, that they had for-power responsibilities coming from Second World War that they couldn't just sign over. You could argue it either way in a court. It was very far from being obvious that Khrushchev was wrong on the simple legalities of who should control access to Berlin. He was not saying, remember, that he was kicking out the American garrison in Berlin. That would have been clearly against the World War II Accords. But he was saying this is East German territory. The accords, the agreements at the end of the war do not clearly specify this issue of access. That's true. And I'm just going to turn it over to the East Germans. War, if it had come, would have come out of that particular legal dispute, not over a clear-cut case of aggression or invasion by anybody else. So if the East Germans said, you, the Americans, cannot now come on the ground, at least, into our territory, we would have sent troops to vindicate our view of the real political needs and of the legality. And the East Germans would have opposed them. Had we pushed through, we would have then actually pulled back and sent more troops, a bigger patrol. The plans that we inherited, well, if those had been opposed by the Soviets, and there was, I recall, I think 7 Soviet armored divisions in the immediate vicinity of Berlin. Had they been opposed, we couldn't have gone a lot further. We could have sent a division. I think the contingency plans went that high to send a division. But very quickly you get to a point where our troops themselves would be surrounded, in between, if not wiped out. At which point our NATO threats to initiate nuclear war would become highly credible, because every time, to initiate nuclear war if necessary, in Europe, because every time that American or Allied troops were surrounded since the Second World War ended, the U.S. President has, in fact, considered seriously the imminent initiation of nuclear war on a tactical basis to protect those troops or to deter their people surrounding them. Very briefly, I don't want to go into the details here, but briefly the occasions we know about from data that is now unclassified or from memoirs, but which I don't expect you to know. I don't find Americans are aware of this. They include when Marines were surrounded at the Chosin Reservoir in 1950, November 1950. On December 1st, President Truman made a public threat that we were considering the use of nuclear weapons, which we were. That announcement, by the way, was sort of brushed off by a lot of American commentators incorrectly, but it led to a great dispute in Britain and led Prime Minister Attlee to make his first flight across the ocean at an advanced age to protest with President Truman and to ask not only that they not do that, but he asked for an assurance as an ally, our closest ally, that the U.S. would confer and consult with the, in fact, would not use nuclear weapons without agreement of our partner, our then partner on nuclear matters. Attlee did not get that assurance, and no successor ever has up to Margaret Thatcher. There's a dispute, going on right now as to whether the U.S. could use its cruise missiles without the approval of the British government at that time? And the answer is yes, they could. No president has ever given a veto to the British for use of those weapons, or to the Germans or anyone else. So it would be, their lives then would depend upon the judgment of the American president, which in that particular case was focusing upon the risk to 2 brigades of Marines surrounded in Korea, a cause that the British, even though they were part of the UN command, did not regard as absolutely central to their survival. In 1953, French were surrounded at Dien Bien Phu, and President Eisenhower offered the French 3 nuclear weapons, one or more to be used against China, and at least 2 to be used in the immediate defense of Dien Bien Phu. French turned that down because they were afraid for the danger to their own troops. We were ready to make the experiment, see whether you could do that without killing the troops involved, who happened to be French, but the French did not agree with that. And so in that case, they rejected the weapons, and that was not a success because the threat was not implemented. The French were captured. The Americans never got captured, though. The Marines were again surrounded in 1968 at Quezon, and again, there were many leaks in the press which were correct, that both the commander in the field, Westmoreland, and the Joint Chiefs were considering the possible use of nuclear weapons if necessary. And again, the Marines were not, in the end, attacked by assault on the ground in 1968. Another success which kept the Marines there another couple months until Abrams replaced Westmoreland and took them off another way by helicopter, instead of protecting them with nuclear threats. There were, in other words, alternative ways to assure the security of the Marines. But we were not prepared to undergo the humiliation of taking them off, or what Johnson regarded, or what Westmoreland regarded as humiliation, though Abrams didn't agree. There are other examples. I'm saying that if U.S. troops then were surrounded in such a situation as in Berlin, the Russians, who knew these cases better than you did, would have had every reason to know that those threats were to be taken very, very seriously. In fact, the Eisenhower planning, as I say, that we had inherited from the late 50s and from 1960, called for not just tactical nuclear warfare, but the immediate implementation of our Strategic Air Command war plans. That's the general war plans that I worked on. In case of any conflict with Soviet troops, any conflict led to an argument as to armed conflict. It says, well, what is the definition of armed conflict? For practical purposes here, an important question. And there was agreement, even by the enthusiasts of nuclear weapons in the Air Force, that a platoon skirmish in the Berlin vicinity would not be armed conflict in that sense. How about 2 battalions? Gray area. A division or 2, that's armed conflict. It's controlled by the Soviets. It's not an accident. It's not an unauthorized action by somebody. That's armed conflict. That means the Strategic Air Command flies. That plan, by the way, was changed as a NATO plan only in 1967, Flexible Response Plan, to the point of changing NATO plans to say that if necessary, that is, if non-nuclear forces were inadequate in NATO, in any such context, whether it was a Russian attack or a war that came out of West German involvement in a satellite uprising, or a direct Soviet attack of some sort, the least likely way that might happen. In any such case, we would use nuclear, as one official put it. Our plan is, this is quite exactly right, our plan is to defend with non-nuclear forces, with conventional forces, until we are losing, which all estimates assume would be within hours or days, rightly or wrongly. They assume that. Then to fight with tactical nuclear weapons. That's the difference from Eisenhower. You start with tactical nuclear weapons. These are weapons which average the size of the Nagasaki weapon or Hiroshima weapon destroyed. Short range. And you do that until you're losing, and then you blow up the world. That is, you use SAC. That sounds rhetorical. Let me give some precision to that, because it's not rhetorical. Well, except the world. is not quite what's at stake. What's at stake is essentially every city in the Northern Hemisphere and most of the people of the Northern Hemisphere. So let's stop talking about the world and talk only about plans to kill something like 1 billion people. Only. As Edward Teller keeps pointing out, that leaves more than half the people in the world. And a lot of them are under threat, but a lot of them will live. Not everybody dies. Let me accept that for the moment. I drafted a question for President Kennedy early in 1961, when we were in the process of trying to get these plans changed, that he gave to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which was how many people would die in Russia and China alone if your plans were carried out. Remember, I remind you, these were essentially first strike plans only. I didn't fully realize that when I was working on them. I didn't realize that. I thought we were facing a very strong enemy. It was incredible to think that we would initiate nuclear war against that opponent. I thought I was working on retaliatory plans. That's why I was doing it, to deter war. Even though the plans did say on their face, including the ones I worked on, that they allowed for U.S. initiating the war. Let me make one distinction here, not to confuse you. When people hear the words first strike, they often think of the idea of a strike by one side or the other, out of the blue, a Pearl Harbor type of attack, starting hostilities. That has never been accepted by U.S. President and has never been a basis for U.S. war planning. We could call that preventive war. And although, in fact, high officials have recommended such a course, Senator Symington, then head of Office of Defense Mobilization, did recommend that in 1951 because of this Chinese entry into the Korean War. It's never been accepted by the president. But that's the only type of initiation that's ruled out. If you have reason to, if the president believes that an attack is underway or imminent by the Soviet Union, our planning has always been based on every effort to try to get the initiative to move first, to hit their missiles before their missiles take off, or their planes before their planes take off. That is the promise of the MX, or the Pershing, and really the purpose of it. It is not to sit in the ground and wait till enemy warheads come at you, or land, as the public is sometimes told. If it seems puzzling to you, ever, that the administration seems so relaxed about the very evident reality that the MX warhead in a Minuteman silo will be vulnerable, which it is. Anybody wondered how they could be so unworried about that? The MX is not meant to be there when the enemy warhead arrives. It will have failed in its mission. The MX with its 10 highly precise warheads is designed for one purpose only, and that is to promise the accuracy and the warhead yield and the numbers, to destroy enemy warheads in their concrete silos before the warheads have been launched. That is, a U.S. preemptive strike. Or, the third point I'm about to say, our NATO plans in particular have always called for a willingness to initiate nuclear war on an all-out basis, if necessary, arising out of an ongoing conflict, which we were losing. Since '67, the plan is you don't do that right away. You first try nuclear weapons. Since the Russians have not as many nuclear weapons as we have, but they have probably 17,000 or so tactical nuclear weapons to our 22,000. They have enough to reply with. There's no great reason to believe that our use of nuclear weapons would go unmatched by the Soviet Union. And there would be no advantage at that point. If we're then losing in the tactical, our plans now as then are to go to the strategic level, and that's where the MX comes in, whether or not you expect the other side to be striking you. In such a situation, by the way, you would probably also have that incentive today. You would worry. You'd almost surely would also worry that the Soviets might be about to strike you, precisely because they can follow this same reasoning that I'm giving. They could anticipate that we had bought that weapon in order to hit their missiles, and they would be under great challenge to use their missiles before they lost them. And we can see that, so that in the crisis, again, it works reciprocally here, given the existence of such weapons on both sides, vulnerable first strike weapons, both sides have an incentive to use those weapons fast in a crisis. And that is our way of telling the Soviets, don't let the crisis get that great. Either one of us might go first. And perhaps that's why the Soviets have bought their SS-18, to tell us the same message. Don't let it get that high. And let us hope that one or both succeed in those threats. Because if they don't, the MX and the SS-18 both will fly, and the result will be not much different from what it was 20 years ago, when the Joint Chiefs did answer the question that I drafted for Kennedy. How many would die in Russia and China alone? Their answer was 325 million people. That means that the war plans, which, as I say, in those days, in the absence of a Soviet force, were U.S.-only strikes. Even first strike is almost a misnomer. We virtually had a monopoly on strategic force. They couldn't hit us. In effect, certainly they couldn't hit us second. If we struck first, we could certainly have knocked them out. The 4 ICBMs that they had could have been knocked out by a single American bomber with non-nuclear weapons. So they had essentially no retaliatory capability. That means that we were planning in a situation then where we initiated the strategic nuclear war to kill some 325 million people in the Soviet Union and China. And later questions were needed to ask, well, what's the total bill? Because I hadn't asked initially how many in neighboring areas, how many in NATO, how many in all this. And that turned out to be, well, follow from the fact, for example, that with modern weapons, thermonuclear weapons, H-bomb weapons, Finland was going to be annihilated by fallout alone from our attacks in Leningrad, even if not a single warhead landed in Finland. That was also true of Austria, where I'm going to a peace conference next week, and in Germany, in NATO, of course, generally, but looking at contiguous countries, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Japan, were all knocked out by the fallout from our weapons. That's the nature of thermonuclear war as opposed to atomic war. H-bomb war with its warhead, with its fallout, with its enormous explosive yield, reflected in the fact that every thermonuclear weapon, every H-bomb, requires a Nagasaki-type A-bomb, atomic bomb, as its trigger. Matter of interest, how many people did not know that, honestly? Well, it's an important thing to know about what happened, not in 1945, but in 55, 56, when we switched over to H-bombs, and when the explosive yield of weapons went up by a factor of 1,000 times at that point. That was the revolution. That created the crisis that the world is really facing now. But let me pull some of these together now, points in terms of policy. It was always true that the enemies to which, that on the one hand, let me back off. Most of the threats we have made, in fact, in the past, and probably in the future, would be against opponents who do not have nuclear weapons. That's the more prudent way to make threats, and that's the way it's been. But virtually every one of those people, those countries, have been allies or clients of the Soviet Union. So the question was, and since 49, or a few years later, the Soviet Union has had the ability to retaliate, at least on a, quote, as the Pentagon calls it, tit for tat, or retaliate in kind with nuclear weapons against those allies or against our forces in the field. And that's been a very lively consideration in the minds even of the president. The question was how to deter the Soviets from retaliating to our use of nuclear weapons in defense of our interventionary forces. And that's the problem today in the Middle East or elsewhere, where our immediate opponents are very unlikely to be Soviet troops, or the Central America, where our immediate opponents are not Soviet troops. President Eisenhower, for example, was not at all confident that the Soviets would not reply. Just as the French in '53 worried about that bomb against China because it would have what Prime Minister Bidault called incalculable consequences, that is, the possibility that France would be hit in return. And he was right to worry about that because that was something the Soviets could do as allies of the Indochinese. They couldn't hit the U.S., but they could hit Europe. And Bidault backed down. He chose to be back down, despite the fact that it was French troops who were at risk at that moment. They're not a great power. As George III said when he was urged to cut the losses in the American Revolution by his Prime Minister, Lord North, he says, a small country can lose a war, but a great power cannot afford to do so. He said, you want me to get out of the colonies in America? All very well. Of course, eventually he did. It took a long time. He says, all very well, but what about Ireland? What about India? Domino theory. And these are the dominoes that he was worried about, with some reason. Though he still got Ireland. There's no Gandhi in Ireland. Maybe that's the answer. Same way. The U.S. was all very well for the French to let their troops to be captured, but not earlier. When they was faced with this stalemate in Korea, then Eisenhower did choose to make the threat, but records in his memoirs that he was very worried at the effects on on Japan. There might be retaliation against Japan. He was not worried enough to tell the Japanese that this might be coming their way, or to refrain from the threat, but he said it did anguish him. The difference, though, in all those cases was that the way to bet was that the Russians would back down. In 1953, it's now come out, just this year we've gotten good unclassified estimates have come out. The Russians did not yet have deployed a single operational weapon, even against Europe. In 61, they had 4 ICBMs against the U.S. In 62, the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when they backed down, 10 operational missiles. Thanks, however, to that success, Khrushchev was replaced by Prime Minister Brezhnev, who apparently made a deal with the armed forces who helped him get the office that they would never have to back down that way again. And the basis, at least for that reason, and the basis for that would be they would never be in that inferior position. They would pay whatever it took to bring the Russians up to parity. They did that. They spent an enormous amount on this, more than we were then spending because we'd spent it earlier on Minuteman missiles and concrete. President Kennedy designed his program of 1,200 and then became 1,000 Minuteman missiles in November of 61, which is some months after the services had all agreed that what the Soviets had was 4. In the face of the 4, 1,000 seemed a good number to President Kennedy, and that was not in order to deter the Soviets from using their 4. It was to make sure that as the Soviets built up, they did not retaliate if he had to make threats in Indochina, which he didn't have to make, but Johnson did for him in 68, to keep the Soviets out of it in that case. And that's why the buildup is right now. The reason for hundreds of billions of dollars to be spent on strategic nuclear weapons in the Reagan program, which was first the Carter program, essentially. Almost no difference between them. Slight difference in scale, and the B-1 is added by Reagan, but otherwise the program is essentially Carter's program. Closely related to Carter's threat, repeated by Reagan shortly thereafter, on the Middle East. We would make a ground presence in the Middle East, and if those troops were interfered with, as we now have that ground presence, and if those troops were interfered with to a point they couldn't cope by Soviet influence, the Soviets would be, quote, facing World War III. That's Reagan's words, and it's also Harold Brown's exact words, who was Secretary of Defense for Carter. World War III started by whom? If we're talking about Iran, which was the immediate occasion of those threats, we're talking about a country on the border of the Soviet Union and close to 10,000 miles away from us. The Soviets would outnumber us perhaps 20-1, according to Pentagon reports. And I read at that point. And that's not because they have a bigger army, it's because it's on their border. They would no more be able to, we would no more be able to stop the Soviets from going into Iran with non-nuclear forces than the Soviets could stop us from going into Nicaragua or Mexico, make it easier, or Canada. So who would start the nuclear war that President Reagan and President Carter talk about? As in '61 over Berlin, and for the same reason, it would be the U.S. That is the threat he's making, though not so clearly as to arouse you, to the barricades, exactly. He's not threatening to hit Moscow if Marines are surrounded in Syria or Lebanon or Iran. He's threatening to hit local Russian or other targets with tactical nuclear weapons. But if the Soviets now replied with the weapons they now have, the threats then would be to use other weapons, like the Pershing, like the intermediate range weapons of various kinds, at least. And if those are replied to, that's what the MX is for, and the Trident D5 and others. In short, this entire buildup is meant to increase our ability to make the world safe for U.S. interventionary forces by backing them up with the threat of tactical nuclear war initiated by the United States. And secondly, the MX, that's what the neutron bomb is for, among other things. Secondly, the MX is a further backup, strategic backup, and the Trident II or D5 missile and others are to back up that threat of tactical nuclear force, to make, in effect, it safe for the relatively safe for the United States to initiate tactical nuclear war in such a case, with some hope that the Soviets will not reply, to make the world safe for American neutron bombs, you might say, safe from retaliation, by the threat that if the Russians did reply, as they could, they would be risking all-out war. The bill for the all-out war comes now as then to something like 600 million people to 1 billion, measured in holocausts. It's about 100 Nazi holocausts. The Catholic bishops are running up against a concern that the United States or any country should not be using the threat of causing 100 million or more murders of non-combatants as an instrument of policy. Shouldn't be making the threat at all, in fact, under any circumstances, as their second draft put it. They're now working on a third draft. I think that's a good position. You don't have to be a Catholic to believe, in fact, that it is both imprudent to be making such threats and wrong. Imprudent, let me underline, in a world which now has 1,400 Soviet missiles with thousands of warheads, which are the direct consequence and cost of our successes in Taiwan and Berlin and Cuba, which the Russians set out to prevent in the future as successes, and the replacement of Khrushchev by Brezhnev, and specifically one other thing, the refusal of any administration, spurred on by lobbyists like Edward Teller and the Livermore Labs, to propose, really, a comprehensive test ban which would bar, or at any rate to sign a test ban which would ban underground testing, stop the testing. And the price of that refusal, which has been motivated by the desire of these labs and the president to have the new weapons which depended on testing, the price of that refusal in order to get the weapons is the 1,400 Soviet weapons that did not exist in '61, '62, and that would not exist today with that test ban. The price of a refusal to end the arms race by a freeze, by a flight testing freeze or a warhead freeze in '67, '68, '69, '70, is that those 1,400 Russian weapons have thousands of warheads today. I don't trust the Soviets to back down as fast, having spent that $1 trillion or so on that equipment for this purpose, as they did 20 years ago. The incentive to make the threats is the same as before. The geography is the same. Iran is still on the border of the Soviet Union. Berlin is still inside East Germany. The geography is the same. Cuba still offers itself as a target that we can isolate. That's geography. And we're still making the threats. One thing that has changed, as I say, is the Soviet capability to stand up to those threats and see whether we'll back up. I would like to believe they were prudent enough to back down again. I wish they would. In any such situation, that's what they ought to do. I don't trust them to do that any more than I would trust Reagan or his successor not to carry out the threat if the Russians didn't back down. It is both wildly reckless and dangerous to be making those threats and to be buying the weapons today to back them up and to encourage further threats. And it is wrong, deeply wrong. Many people are reflecting that, I think, not only by voting, not only by telling their congressmen, which is absolutely necessary, that those congressmen will in effect lose their jobs if they don't try to cut this arms race off. Many Americans are also, and I absolutely support those measures of legislative, lobbying, campaigning, I do them all, letter writing, and they are essential. They are also going to jail to say that it's not only extremely urgent crisis that we are facing, to which people must be woken up, their consciences must be also woken up to the fact that it is wrong to be gambling the fate of human life in the Northern Hemisphere on any of these issues, from the little ones to the big ones. I believe they're right. That's why I get arrested. That's why I encourage other people to consider that. Because I know it works. It worked on me. I wouldn't have thought of doing something that would make me face charges of 115 years in jail for the Pentagon Papers, just by seeing people demonstrating. It wouldn't have occurred to me. It took people who were going to jail to put the thought in my mind, what could I do if I were willing to go to jail? And then I thought of something useful and did it. And did it. And I hope the film Gandhi will suggest to a lot of other people that they have more freedom and more power than they may have realized to affect events if they are willing to take a risk. I think, by the way, what inhibits them before that is not that they're unwilling to take a risk, but that it doesn't occur to them that this is within the range of options of a civilian, a citizen, a patriotic citizen, or that it might work. As to whether it might work, without this whole range of actions, including nonviolent civil disobedience, bombs would still be falling, I think, on Vietnam, from our carriers, from Guam, from B-52s. President Nixon was no less determined to keep the bombing of Vietnam going than is President Reagan determined to keep the arms race going, and that's very determined. He was not allowed to do that because Congress took away the money for it in an unprecedented move. But that approach, that democratic approach, responding to then unprecedented pressure from the United States public, is not unprecedented now. It happened. We can't say to ourselves, I'm just one person, we're just 100 persons, we can't change this. Look at the limitations. The limitations are real, but the power is also real in this country, and it puts on us a responsibility because of our democratic capabilities in this country to do things. It gives us a responsibility that the Russian people can't really be said to have for getting out of Afghanistan. The Russians don't have that way of getting out of Afghanistan, you might say, that the United States did have. And that is not a weakness of our system, it's a glorious strength of our system. I believe that the people now going to jail and facing jail, and there are about 1 million of them, in non-registration, in resistance to the registration, and people who have gone to jail in that, since the Carter Doctrine and since Reagan's advances toward Nicaragua, have so far kept combat units out of El Salvador, which I believe would be there were it not for that process. So I think those people risking jail and going to jail are being powerful right now. They don't have to just hope for it. They have been effective already. As for the arms race, I think there's only one way to stop it at this point. Face it with a president who is determined to use his power to keep it going. And that is for Congress to cut off the funds, to say to the president, we do not want nuclear threats made and we do not want the weapons built that are designed to back up and encourage those threats. We will not let you have them. And the way to give congressmen the courage to say that to the president is to point out to them that they will lose their jobs if they don't. You can do that. You have the power. That gives you the responsibility. Let's do it. Thank you.